From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Special thanks to those of you who waited in the rain for a signature from Marilynne earlier this afternoon. The weather seems perhaps appropriately for Marilynne to have turned rather biblical. Let me just read this boilerplate and get it out of the way. On behalf of the Library of Congress, welcome to the 2009 National Book Festival. We hope you're having a wonderful day celebrating the joy of reading here on the National Mall. Before we begin, I want to inform you that the pavilion's presentations are being filmed for the Library of Congress's website and for their archives. Please be mindful of this as you enjoy the presentation. I'm not sure what the subtext is there, but be mindful. In addition, please don't sit on the camera risers that are located in the back of the pavilion. Thank you. Now then, I'm David Kippen. I'm the Director of Literature for National Reading Initiatives at that organization that Azar was mentioning earlier, the National Endowment for the Arts, which is all a fancy way of saying that I direct a program called The Big Read, which it helps cities and towns around the country do these one city, one book programs. Even does it in Washington, D.C. on occasion. We've developed a list of about 30 books and materials around them, including the first book by the woman I'm here to introduce, Marilynne Robinson. The book was Housekeeping. Those of you, I hope you'll avail yourselves of the opportunity to collect some of the materials surrounding this book that we created, a wonderful CD and a reader's guide and a teacher guide. You'll find them at the back table there. Thinking about what to say today, it occurred to me that I think just about every writer, every great writer anyway, probably bad ones too, would be most closely identified with a single part of speech. For some writers, it's the adjective. For some writers, it's the verb. For Marilynne, I think it's the noun. Some of Marilynne's nouns are just so unexpected and so ringingly perfect that, well, I wanted to read you a quotation, one among many, and it was not an easy decision to make, but I relied on our reader's guide when in doubt, and I fished out this one from Gilead. I hope you think as highly of it as I do. I'm not saying never, this is the voice of John Ames, the narrator of Gilead. I'm not saying never doubt or question. The Lord gave you a mind so that you would make honest use of it. I'm saying you must be sure that the doubts and questions are your own, not, so to speak, the mustache and walking stick that happen to be the fashion of any particular moment. The mustache and walking stick that happen to be the fashion of any particular moment. Just the perfect nouns. Let me just recapitulate before I yield the stage Marilynne's corpus. It started with Housekeeping. Then came two works of nonfiction, Mother Country, Britain, the Welfare State, and Nuclear Pollution. Then came a book of essays, The Death of Adam, Essays on Modern Thought. Then came Gilead, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And I was talking earlier with Maria Rana, the erstwhile editor of the Washington Post Book Review and the woman who helped pull all this together with my colleague John Peedy and John Cole of the Library of Congress. She was reminiscing about being a judge, one of 3 judges for the Pulitzer Prize the year that Gilead won, and how, rather unusually for that award, the judges were unanimous in their recommendations, but they are only recommendations. They have to forward 3 books to, I believe it's the Pulitzer board, and they choose one. But they so wanted Gilead to win that they had to figure out how to write the descriptions of these 3 books in such a way that the Pulitzer board would make the right choice. I don't know quite how she did that, but as you can tell, they succeeded, and we're grateful for it. She followed up Gilead with a book that the critic James Woods, arguably the best critic in the country, although he has a blind spot about Thomas Pynchon, which we won't speak of at the moment. James Woods said of Gilead that it wasn't, said of Home that it wasn't a sequel to Gilead, it was a brother to Gilead. Wonderful bit of criticism there. Anyway, one final quote, and then I will turn Marilynne loose. It's on page 5 of our reader's guide. And I wanted you to hear this. She says in the introduction to her book of essays, I want to believe there are geniuses scheming to astonish the rest of us just for the pleasure of it. Well, take it from me, there are. There are geniuses scheming to astonish the rest of us just for the pleasure of it. There are. Marilynne Robinson.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I think we must all love books very much to be here so late afternoon in the rain. In any case, is the microphone where it ought to be? Okay. I'm going to read from relatively late in Home. This is the scene where Jack has decided that he's going to ingratiate himself with his godfather, his namesake, Reverend John Ames, by going to Ames's church. He's doing this because he has come home with certain sort of battered, frail hopes that he hoped his father would help him to fulfill, and he's decided that his father cannot and perhaps would not. So he's turning to John Ames. The very next day, having toiled earnestly in the vegetable patch and the flower beds from dawn till noon, and having tightened the joints of the 3 Adirondack chairs that had always slouched together under the kitchen window, as if to be indolently serviceable in the event that something in the yard between them and the barn should attract spectators, and having restrung the clothesline, he came into the house, ironed a shirt, and polished his shoes. "I'm feeling useful," he said. "Productive. That's good for morale. So is the tan." He pushed up his sleeve to show her. "There's a definite line there." So there is. She had learned to worry about these hectic outbursts of purposefulness and to know there was no point in trying to damp them down. He said, "I believe this is Thursday, so tomorrow is Friday, and Ames will probably be working on his sermon. He won't welcome interruption." He said, "I will probably go to church on Sunday. I can do that. My suit no longer smells combustible, just slightly automotive. I wouldn't want to alarm anyone." He laughed. So all this was in preparation for supper at the Ameses, for which he had not been invited. But he left the house in the early evening, pausing in the door to look at her and shrug, as if to say, "Wish me luck." When he was not home for supper, she told her father that she thought he might have been invited by Ames and Lila. "Yes," her father said, "I hope John will take some interest in him. That is a thing I've wished for many years. When you give a man a namesake, you do expect a certain amount of help. Ames was a help to me, of course, not to Jack so much. I don't mean to criticize. I guess I wasn't much help to him either, as far as that goes." The old man wanted to wait for him in the porch, so they sat there together in the mild night. "You can't see the lightning bugs through these screens," he said. "You can't see the stars. But at least you get the breeze. You hear the crickets." After a little while, he said, "Ames will need his rest. Old fellows can't tolerate these late nights. I hope he will realize that." And then they heard footsteps, and Jack came up the walk and up the steps. "Nice evening," he said. His voice was soft and calm. Glory knew that her father noticed, too. "Yes," the old man said. "Yes, it is. A fine evening." Jack said, "They were very kind. The boy likes me, and Mrs. Ames seems to think I'm all right." "I suppose you talked a little politics, Jack." "Yes, sir. He says Stevenson is a very fine man, no doubt." His father laughed. "There's no persuading him. He'll agree with anything you say, but when the chips are down, it's Eisenhower. Yes, I know what it's like trying to reason with him where politics are concerned. He hasn't been around so much lately. Maybe I've been trying too hard." Jack said. He talked a little bit about his grandfather. "Yes, he likes to tell the old stories. The Boughtons weren't here for most of that. We left Scotland in the fall of 1870, so we missed out on the war and the rest of it. There was a lot of what you might call fanaticism around here in the early days, even among Presbyterians. That old fellow was right in the middle of it, from what I've heard. And then in his old age, he was about as crazy as it's possible to be and still be walking the streets. I would never have named you after that, John Ames. We were used to him, of course. We felt sorry for him, but he was crazy when I knew him, and before that too, I believe. Jack was quiet for a while. Then he said, Ames seems to have a lot of respect for him. His father said, the old settlers, you know, the old families, they used to tell stories they thought were just wonderful, and then I think they began to realize that the world had changed and maybe they should reconsider a few things. It's taken them a while. Ames was pretty embarrassed about the old fellow while he lived, always talking with Jesus. I suppose he didn't tell you about that. He told me. He told me the story about his grandfather leaving Maine for Kansas because he had a dream that Jesus came to him as a slave and showed him how the chains rankled his flesh. I'd heard the story before, of course. I always thought it sounded enviable. I mean, to have that kind of certainty. It's hard to imagine, hard for me to imagine. Certainty can be dangerous, the old man said. Yes, sir, I know, but if Jesus is Jesus, it seems as though he might have shown someone his chains. I mean, in that situation. You might be right, Jack. I'm sure Ames would agree. But when you see where we are now, still trying to settle these things with violence, I don't know. Live by the sword and die by the sword. Jack cleared his throat. The protests in Montgomery are nonviolent. The old man said, but they provoke violence. It's all provocation. There was a long silence. Then Jack said, this week I will go to church. I will definitely go to church. That's wonderful, Jack, yes. He helped his father to bed, and then he came into the kitchen. You were right, he said. It was fine. I said the grace. I'd practiced this time. I was polite, I believe, and I didn't talk enough to get myself in trouble. I don't think I did. I'm not saying anything changed, but it wasn't a disaster. Macaroni and cheese. I cleaned my plate. He laughed. Then Jack took the Ameses some early apples and some plums he said could be ripened on a windowsill, and he played a little catch with the boy, and he even helped Lila move the Reverend's desk and some of his books down to the parlor so that he would not have to deal with the stairs. Very neighborly, he said, friend-like. Glory had no reason for concern about all this, except that Jack was intent on it. He seemed to have invested so much calculation in it that it bordered on hope, now that the Reverend and his family had warmed to him a little. Dear God, she thought, they are the kindest people on earth. Why should I worry? She had talked him into trusting them, which would have been entirely reasonable in any other circumstance. But his reservations were the fruit of his experience, and his experience was the fruit of his being Jack, always Jack, despite these sporadic and intense attempts at escape, at being otherwise. Dear God in heaven, no one could know as well as he did that for him caution was always necessary. Sunday came and Jack rose early, loitered in the kitchen, drinking coffee, refused breakfast, brushed his suit and his hat. He came downstairs at 9:45, looking as respectable as he ever did, tipped his hat, and walked out the door. She got her father up and brought him into the kitchen, where he lingered over his eggs and toast, then over the newspaper, then over a Christian Century he had read weeks before, then over the Bible. Finally, he fell into that sleep or prayer that was his refuge in times of high emotion. At 2:00, Jack still had not come home, so she told her sleeping father that she was going out to look around a little, and he nodded abruptly, as if to say it was high time. She couldn't hunt her brother down as if he were a lost child or an incompetent of some kind. There was nothing he, therefore she, dreaded more than the possibility that he might be embarrassed in any way that could be anticipated and avoided. Enough that there was an incandescence of unease about him whenever he walked out the door, or for that matter, whenever his father summoned him to one of those harrowing conversations. or while he waited for the mail or watched the news. She went to the barn, and there he was, in the driver's seat of the DeSoto, with his head tipped back and his hat over his eyes. She tapped on the window, and he roused himself and smiled at her, an effort. Then he reached over and opened the passenger door. "Hop in," he said. "I was just collecting myself. Couldn't face your papa quite yet." Then he said, "Ah, little sister, these old fellows play rough. They look so harmless, and the next thing you know, you're counting broken bones again." What happened? He preached. The text was Hagar and Ishmael. The application was the disgraceful abandonment of children by their fathers. And the illustration was my humble self, sitting there beside his son with the eyes of Gilead upon me. I think I was aghast. His intention, no doubt, to appall me, that is, to turn me white, as I'm sure he did, whiter. "Well," she said, "I find this hard to believe. It just doesn't seem possible." Yes, such a kind old man. I don't think I'll be asking your advice anytime soon, pigtails." He laughed. I left through the chancel. I had half a mind to pull my jacket up over my head. Then he said, "Sweet Jesus, I am tired. And now you're crying. Please don't do that." "It's just tears," she said. "They don't matter. I'll leave you alone if you want me to." "No," he said, "don't do that either. Maybe you can help me sort this out." There was a silence. "Well, for one thing," she said, "I know he wouldn't have mentioned you by name. He would never do that. He didn't say Jack Boughton, the notorious sinner in the first pew, the gasoline-scented fellow. That's correct. And he'd have prepared his sermon days ago. I'm sure he had no idea you would be there this morning." Excellent point. I thought of that myself. But through the worst of it, he wasn't even speaking from notes, Glory. The old devil was extemporizing. Very effectively, I might add, for a man of his age. Anyway, I would have been on his mind while he worked on it, all that ingratiating behavior just beneath his window. He laughed. Then he said, "Don't cry." He produced a handkerchief from the breast pocket in which he also carried the little leather case, one of her father's beautiful handkerchiefs. She said, "I'll never forgive him." He looked at her. "I appreciate the sentiment. I mean it. It could be senility, I suppose. I still won't forgive him. He was like a father to me. It's sad. It's terrible." Jack drew a long breath. "Consider our situation, Glory. 2 middle-aged people in decent health, sane and civilized, generally well-disposed toward the world. Perhaps I'm only speaking for myself here. Sitting in an abandoned DeSoto in an empty barn, snowflake not far from our thoughts, pondering one more thoroughly predictable and essentially meaningless defeat. Does this strike you as odd?" She laughed. "It's just ridiculous." "I had no plans when I left Gilead," he said. "Survival on terms I could convince myself were tolerable. That was the pinnacle of my aspirations. I did not anticipate failure. I have awakened in the occasional gutter from time to time, figuratively speaking, of course, and I have thought to myself, just a little effort would improve my situation dramatically. So there was that optimism. It may have been youth." "You were all right for 10 years. Almost 10. 7.5 if we are speaking of sobriety. 9.5 if the measure is a sometimes pleasurable engagement with life." Della. They were quiet for a while. He said, "I used to think we might slip into Gilead under cover of night, throw a little gravel at Ames's window, say our I-do's, get his blessing, or at least his signature." "You'd have asked Ames to marry you?" He shrugged. He's always awake at odd hours. You'd have tipped your hat to the family homestead on the way out of town, I suppose. No doubt. I never really thought through the fine points. I'm sure I would have tipped my hat. That's good to know. Then he said, I came back thinking we might be able to make a life here, she and I. Why did I think that? I came here because everything had fallen to pieces and she'd run off to her family. Don't get the wrong idea, but I was clutching at a straw coming to Gilead, no doubt about that. I've had some experience with them, straws. He looked at her sidelong, bemused, worldly, sad, spent. You've never just talked to Papa about this. He laughed. Some things are sacred, Glory. You've never talked to him about old love letters. Then he said, Our father is not a man of the world, shall we say, but he would no doubt assume that a 9-year relationship with my sullied self might have involved some degree of cohabitation. I hope I haven't offended you. He glanced at her. He might, never meaning to, only by implication, cast an aspersion. I don't know how I would deal with that. I'm trying to stay sober. She said, How do you know I didn't do that? Cohabit. He said very gently, Call it a wild guess. Condescension, she thought, but kindly meant, brotherly. He said, I don't recommend it. There are laws. A person could end up with the cops at his door. He smiled. Sorry, poor Jack. The truth was she wished there had been more to her endless supposed engagement, that there was not her fiancé's extremely scrupulous respect for her to, in retrospect, embitter her sense of the fraudulence of it all. Still, she wished she had the letters back and the ring. Sacred, she thought. Strange to think of it that way. Time and again she had read through the half-dozen letters that moved her, and even they sometimes seemed so commonplace that it frightened her, as if a precious thing had been lost and she could not find it, search as she might. Then she would notice a phrase, something about loneliness or weariness, or the view from a train window, the intimacy of the ordinary, and her heart would stir. She had ticked the margins beside these lines to spare herself the vertiginous sense that there was nothing in the letters at all worth cherishing. And then when she looked at them again, she could not always see why she had chosen these passages, and again she would be frightened. Why did it comfort her to trust him? The letters were so precious to her, and what were they? They were bland and prosaic, 3 readings out of 4, but when they touched her, she was suffused with joy. There was no other word for it. She knew that if she had kept them, she would still look at them to see if there was anything in them to account for the sweet power they had had for her, and if she did not find it, she would read them again. When she thought of them, she put aside all bitterness and folly and disillusionment, as no one else ever could, no one who listened to her with compassion. Sympathy would corrupt something wonderful, which secrecy and a kind of shame had kept safe for her. She said, I've wondered if it might not be easier to be somewhere else, where my life would be my own at least. My thought too, and I gave somewhere else a pretty good try. Now I'm home again in Iowa, the shining star of radicalism. It is the desire of the tattered moth for the shining star that has brought me home, little sister. She said, Well, Iowa's a pretty big state. He laughed. Yes, why am I here when I might be in Ankeny, Ottumwa? That strikes me as a fair question. Maybe because I have no sister there. I'd visit. He nodded. Kind of you. Then he said, I knew I would need help. I thought the old gent might help me, but I didn't realize that he was so old. I couldn't find work on my own, so I decided to place my hopes in the kindly Reverend Ames, which brings us to the present moment. Then he said, I just wanted to come home. Even if I couldn't stay, I wanted to see the place. I wanted to see my father. I was bewildered, I suppose. He laughed. I was scared to come home. It was as much as I could do to get on the bus and stay on it. I was largely successful at that, all in all. Too bad. Too bad for the old man. It's amazing to me that I can still disappoint him. I knew I would. He touched the scar beneath his eye. Well, she said, he's worried. I left him at the kitchen table. He's probably uncomfortable. I should go inside. What should I tell him? Oh, let me think. Tell him my life is endless pain and difficulty for reasons that are no doubt apparent to anyone I pass on the street, but obscure to me, and that I am flummoxed and sitting in the DeSoto, but will probably be in for supper. It would be simpler if you just came inside with me now. He sighed. No doubt you're right. And I do know why my life is the way it is, Gloria. I was joking about that. I wouldn't want you to think I don't. I'm fresh from a sermon on the subject. He glanced at her. Gloria said, I'll never forgive him. Jack said, thank you. I'm touched. Then he said, I'll forgive him. Maybe I've forgiven him already. When she looked at him, he shrugged and said, he might take it as a sign of character. It might look like generosity or humility or something. Anyway, neither one of us can risk upsetting the old man by holding a grudge against Ames. I mean, one that he or Ames might be aware of. He said, I've thought this over pretty carefully. Either my manly pride insists that I confront him, which even I would not descend to, or it obliges me to leave town in a huff of some kind to avoid that whipped cur impression even I dread, or else I seize upon the only undamaging choice left to me, which might also have the look of virtue, I believe. Then I suppose I'll have to forgive him too. I would appreciate that. It would make things easier. They walked up to the house together. Their father was still at the table, a little fierce with the tedium of his situation, which had compounded his anxiety. "Ah, there you are," he said, as they came through the door. "I was beginning to think..." And then he saw Jack's face. Jack smiled. He said, "A powerful sermon. It gave me a lot to consider." "Well, that's all right," his father said. "No harm in that, I suppose. I'm sure he must have meant well. Nothing I would have expected. He seems to have squandered a wonderful opportunity." His voice became softer and his gaze more fixed as realization settled in. Jack said, "Please don't worry about it. It really doesn't matter," and went up to his room. Days passed without any word from Ames. Their father read and prayed and brooded, and every time the telephone rang, he said, "If it's Ames, tell him I'm dead." I think maybe we have time for a couple of questions. Or we could go somewhere and get warm.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Gilead and Home have been characterized as Americans' great reformed novels, and I wondered if you could explain that and whether or not you agree with that characterization.
Well, for people that might be unfamiliar with the terminology, the Reformed tradition is basically the mainline Protestant tradition, excluding Lutheranism, you know? It's basically Calvinism. And the Presbyterians and Congregationalists that I write about are in this tradition. I think that anyone who knows that tradition recognizes that that is the sort of reverberating chamber that both of the novels are active within. But I have been very happy at the reception that the books have received from Catholics. The Catholic Church in general has been very receptive to this book. I've talked at a lot of their universities and so on, and find that they're teaching it, they give it to each other for their birthdays and so on. I'm delighted with that. I'm also delighted with the fact that it's being published in more than 30 languages, and that it's going into Arabic and Vietnamese, as well as any number of other languages. And so I didn't know, I never think about a potential audience when I'm writing, but the fact that it has reached a much larger audience than perhaps the word reformed would describe is something that's extremely pleasing to me.
Hi.
Oh, yes,
hi.
hello.
Hi. I was wondering what accounted for the stylistic difference between Housekeeping and Gilead. I realized there was a long passage of time, but I'm wondering if that was sort of a conscious decision, if the subject material demanded it, or if you just sort of, what accounts for the difference between the two novels, which I think is pretty dramatic.
It is. Well, my novels are very much driven by voice, and the voice is very much constructed around its problem. I mean, for Ruth, she's trying to, she continuously makes these sort of imaginative rescues of lost things, and she does it, by these sort of metaphorical reconstructions of reality that she makes. That sounds, I mean, if you haven't read the book, it really is better than I'm making it sound. But with John Ames, of course, the problem is that he's trying to make himself understood by a young man he will never know, and the burden of his writing is hers is much more a meditation, his is an attempt to make himself known. I think that that's the major stylistic difference that's reflected. Yes?
I'm curious about the long gap between Housekeeping and Gilead, and I hadn't realized you'd written some nonfiction in the interim, but could you talk about that? Why you waited a long time between the two novels?
Well, I had a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main ones, I think, is that I don't like the cliches that are used to represent the culture so frequently in journalism and all that. So we're continuously getting presented with these statements about ourselves that I feel are they're not descriptive. They have no, humanity in them. My first way of avoiding what I felt were otherwise irresistible cliches or associations was to write about a landscape that I knew very well, that was very unknown to people in general, my own little mountains and lake. And that was a satisfactory solution for one book, but I didn't want to be trapped in that solution. And so I thought that the way that I could sort of liberate myself from kind of thinking that I didn't really feel was mine was by sort of re-educating myself. This is after my PhD, I started reading everything just trying to literally change my mind so that I could feel that I was writing from another place, another sensibility. That's what I did. And it took 24 years, frankly, and 2 works of nonfiction.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello? Hello?
Oh,
Hi.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. This, in a way, dovetails the question about the form of your works. Something that I think is very just kind of innately beautiful about letter writing is how it makes whoever's absent feel present. And that was such a, I think, very beautiful dimension of Gilead. And I was wondering what your kind of thoughts and feelings were on the letter and just kind of that particular form of writing when you were speaking in the voice of John Ames.
Right. I was surprised to write an epistolary novel to the extent that I did because, frankly, I never enjoyed the form, But it seemed to me that under the burden of this desire to make oneself known by the only means that would have been available to him. There's an extra candor that emerges in it, you know, a sort of loss of surface that I think a lot of epistolary novels acknowledge as a reality in letter writing, you know. You know, the burden of love. I think that most of us are fortunate enough to love several people, you know, and I think more or less continuously feel the frustration of making them understand the degree to which this is true, you know, and the feeling of them in their absence, I think, is something that really brings this forward. And so there's an element of that certainly in the book, trying to break through what is a frustration in any case of how much other people actually mean to you, you know.
Thank you very much.
Yes, you've written fiction. You've also written essays and nonfiction. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the psychological or the emotional difference for you as a writer working in these different genres, these approaches, how it feels to you when you're doing these different kinds of writing.
You know, it feels very different. It really does. I don't believe particularly in that left brain, right brain thing, or I certainly don't consider one part of the brain more rational than the other or any of that other stuff. But the fact is that I feel different physiologically, in effect, when I'm writing fiction and when I'm writing nonfiction. When I write nonfiction on a computer, sitting upright in an armchair, you know, I write fiction curled up under a cover with a ballpoint pen and a spiral notebook, and try to sort of forget myself physically in the farthest degree that I can. The way in which they're similar is that both of them are voice-driven. But the voice, I mean what I'm saying when I'm writing nonfiction. I mean it passionately, but I'm also aware that I've created a speaker in my mind who is saying these things, so it's not identical with me. And the feeling is the same, only more profoundly so when I'm writing fiction. I don't know who these people are. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.